In terms of geography, I think, I mean, when I started, like my first book, Always the Almost, is set in Wisconsin, which is where I'm from. So it was a lot of, I think I'm always very interested in writing queer and trans people outside of big blue cities who, or at least who come from outside of big blue cities, because a lot, I mean, when I grew up, I basically didn't have any queer books, but when I started to discover them, what became really obvious to me, like in my early 20s, was they were all set in cities. And it was just very much a like, I absolutely have the trajectory of like, I have to get out of this small town if I'm going to be who I am. So I did go to the big blue cities, but I really didn't want I didn't like there was something in me that rebelled against the idea that that was only where queer people existed. Um, so there was like I kind of started really wanting to write about queer people in the Midwest, about like queer people where you don't see them that much, but that doesn't mean they're there. And I think especially now, that feels more important, especially for teenagers, especially for trans teenagers than ever, because it's incredibly isolating and there are so many states that are just like the experience you can have in different states is wildly different. And that was actually like something that felt really challenging was when I was writing In Case You Read This, was that I feel like the states where I can set the kinds of stories that I want to write, which are not very important to me, not just about how hard it is to be queer or trans. The number of states is getting smaller because it's so much harder to be a trans kid and not just be constantly under attack in a lot of places. So that was very much on my mind when I was writing In Case You Read This. It's something that the characters grapple with. One of them is moving from a small town in Illinois to Los Angeles and is really excited to like be in this city where they feel like they're going to be much more accepted. And then the other kid is moving from Los Angeles to a small town in Michigan and really worried about sort of the reverse issue. But I think in that case, I knew I did want to write sort of a Midwestern experience. I live in California now, so it was again sort of writing someplace that I was familiar with, for one of the characters. But I also did do some like just thinking about like where can I set a book where hopefully within by the time it comes out, because when you start writing a book, you know, you get a deal for it to be published, and it's usually like 2 years before the book comes out. So, I was trying to think of like where in the next 2 years do I feel like the legislation isn't just going to totally flip, because I don't want to be sort of writing about an experience of a trans teen in a state that just doesn't feel true anymore. I've met trans teens in places like Texas and in places where it's really hard to even find the books that they want to read. Um, so that was really important to me. And then Nebraska was purely like that I was just trying to think of the most random place for, oh, here's my cat. I was trying to think of like the most random place to meet someone. About the last place that I could think of that any trans teenager would think they were likely to meet someone like them. And it just felt like a hotel in the middle of Nebraska. That feels about as random as you could get. And then I was thinking about the road trip aspect and discovered that Nebraska has some really quite amazing like roadside stops, with just like the randomest stuff there. And that was sort of my way into the book, was just like having them be at one of those stops to kind of set the vibes.